Ex-Nazi Field Marshal assistant exposes Hitler's orders, allowing harassment of female POWs before retreat January 17, 1946, Nuremberg, Germany. The air inside Courtroom 600 hung thick with the weight of cigarette smoke and unspoken histories. Beyond the tall arched windows, the skeletal ruins of Nuremberg stretched beneath a grey sky. Buildings reduced to hollow shells, their shadows long and accusatory. Inside, beneath the glare of courtroom lights rigged by Allied engineers, a man sat in the witness stand, his hands folded carefully in his lap. His uniform was gone now, replaced by the drab wool suit of a defendant stripped of rank, stripped of nation, stripped of everything but memory. His name was General Major Wilhelm Hartmann, though the press had taken to calling him the assistant. For 4 years he had served as a field liaison and administrative officer to Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, one of Hitler's most fervent supporters among the Wehrmacht's upper echelons. Hartmann's face was pale, creased with sleepless nights, and something deeper, something that looked like the slow erosion of a man's inner architecture. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, devoid of the clipped militarism one might expect. He spoke like a man unburdening himself of stones he had carried too long. There were orders, he said, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the prosecutors, beyond the translators, beyond the courtroom itself. Orders that were never written in the official war diaries. Orders transmitted verbally, in closed rooms, among men who believed the war would erase all record of their commands. The stenographer's keys clattered. A journalist in the gallery leaned forward, and in that moment, the world prepared to hear what many had suspected, but few could prove, that the machinery of Nazi warfare had not only brutalized soldiers and civilians in combat, but had systematically dehumanized those it captured, particularly the women who fell into its hands during the chaotic retreats of 1944 and 1945. To understand the confession that would emerge from Courtroom 600, one must first understand the man who issued the orders and the ideology that made such orders possible. Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau was not a reluctant soldier coerced into National Socialism. He was a true believer, a man who fused military tradition with Nazi racial doctrine with the zeal of a convert. Born in 1884 into a Prussian military family, Reichenau rose through the ranks, with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and ideological purity. Unlike many of his peers in the old officer corps who viewed Hitler with aristocratic disdain, Reichenau embraced the Führer's vision. In October 1941, while commanding the Sixth Army in Ukraine, he issued the infamous Severity Order, a directive that explicitly called for the harsh but just retribution against Jewish people and for soldiers to act as bearers of a ruthless racial ideology. This was no rogue general acting beyond his mandate. Reichenau's order was circulated as a model to other commanders. It was praised by Hitler himself. It represented the official merger of Wehrmacht operations and SS extermination policies, a union that would define the Eastern Front's unique brutality. By 1944, however, the tide had turned. The myth of Aryan invincibility, nurtured in the propaganda films and victory parades of earlier years, was crumbling beneath the weight of Soviet artillery and American bombers. The Wehrmacht found itself in retreat, not the orderly tactical withdrawals of staff college manuals, but panicked, desperate flights from enemies who had learned to outfight them, outproduce them, and outlast them. It was during these retreats, in the chaos and rage of collapsing fronts, that certain orders were issued. Orders about prisoners, orders about women. General Major Hartmann had joined Reichenau's staff in the summer of 1943, just as the Eastern Front began to buckle. He was an administrative officer, a man of paperwork and logistics, not a frontline commander. His job was to ensure that directives from Berlin were translated into field orders, that supply requisitions were processed, that the machinery of military bureaucracy kept turning even as the Reich itself began to disintegrate. He was good at his job, efficient, obedient. In his post-war testimony, he would describe himself as a man who believed that following orders was the highest form of duty, a belief that millions of Germans shared, and that millions more would spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile with the atrocities committed in the name of that obedience. Hartmann first encountered the issue of female prisoners of war in late 1943, when Soviet forces began capturing significant numbers of German soldiers in the brutal fighting around Kiev. Among the German wounded evacuated westward were a small number of female auxiliary personnel, radio operators, nurses, administrative clerks, who had been stationed near the front lines. When Soviet forces overran these positions, some of these women were taken prisoner. The propaganda machinery of the Reich seized on these captures with hysteria. Joseph Goebbels' newspapers ran lurid stories of German women subjected to barbaric treatment by Asiatic hordes, stories designed to stiffen resistance and justify ever greater cruelties in return. Whether these specific stories were true or fabricated mattered little in the calculus of total war. They became true in the minds of soldiers who read them, who whispered them to each other in frozen foxholes, who carried them like talismans of righteous hatred. But as the months wore on and German retreats accelerated, a different category of female prisoners began to appear in Wehrmacht custody. Women from Allied nations, French resistance operatives, Soviet partisans, Polish underground fighters, British Special Operations executive agents parachuted behind German lines. These were not uniformed soldiers in the traditional sense, and this ambiguity became a weapon in itself. In the labyrinthine legal structure of Nazi military justice, such women occupied a grey zone. Were they combatants entitled to Geneva Convention protections? Were they spies subject to summary execution? Or were they something else, symbolic targets in a war that had long since abandoned the pretense of civilized restraint? It was November 1944 when Hartmann first heard the phrase that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The setting was a field headquarters in East Prussia, a requisitioned manor house whose grand ballroom had been converted into a war room, its chandeliers removed and replaced with map tables and telephone lines. Reichenau had been dead for nearly 3 years by then, but his successor in the army group, a general whose name Hartmann would later claim not to remember, though many historians believe it was Ferdinand Schörner, Hitler's favourite hard man, had gathered his senior staff for a briefing on retreat protocols. The Red Army was advancing from the east. The Western Allies were grinding through France. Germany's territorial losses were accelerating. And with those losses came a problem that military planners had not seriously contemplated in the glory days of 1940, what to do with prisoners when there was nowhere left to send them, no stable rear areas to house them, no resources to feed them. The general stood before a map of the rapidly shrinking Reich, his finger tracing the red lines of Soviet advances. He spoke of strategic consolidation, of defensive prioritization, of maintaining troop morale in adverse conditions. And then, almost as an aside, he addressed the issue of captured enemy personnel. Interrogate them if they have intelligence value, he said. Otherwise they are a drain on resources we cannot spare. Male prisoners are to be used for labour until they are no longer useful. As for female prisoners, he paused. In that pause, Hartmann would later testify the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The Führer has made clear his views on those who take up arms against the Reich in defiance of natural order. Women who fight as partisans, who engage in sabotage, who serve the enemy in any capacity. These are not soldiers. They are criminals, traitors to their sex and their biology. The Geneva Conventions were written for a different kind of war, for a different kind of enemy. They do not apply here. What came next was delivered in the same even tone one might use to discuss ration schedules. Unit commanders are to use their discretion in maintaining discipline and morale during retreats. Female prisoners are a resource. How that resource is utilized is a matter of operational necessity. No written orders will be issued, no records will be kept, but it is understood, and the Führer has personally indicated that officers are not to be punished for measures taken to preserve unit cohesion in extreme circumstances. Hartmann sat in the back of the room, his pen hovering over his notepad. He did not write down what he had just heard. There was nothing to write. The order was not an order in any documentary sense. It was permission, a moral abdication dressed in the language of military pragmatism. It was an invitation to cruelty without consequence. Later, when the briefing ended and the officers filed out into the cold November night, Hartmann approached a colonel he knew, a career officer from an old Prussian family. "That directive about the female prisoners," Hartmann said carefully. "Are we to—" The colonel cut him off with a glance. "You heard what you heard, or perhaps you heard nothing at all. That is also an acceptable interpretation." The colonel walked away, his breath misting in the freezing air, and Hartmann stood alone beneath the dead trees, understanding for the first time the full dimensions of the machine he served. The reality of what those discretionary measures meant became apparent in the winter and spring of 1945 as Germany's armies collapsed on all fronts. Hartmann's testimony at Nuremberg, corroborated by other witnesses and by the testimonies of survivors, painted a harrowing picture. Female prisoners of war, particularly Soviet, Polish and partisan fighters, were systematically subjected to abuse during the final retreats. The nature of this abuse varied by unit and by commander, but the pattern was consistent. Women were separated from male prisoners, housed in inadequate conditions, denied medical care, and subjected to harassment that ranged from verbal degradation to physical assault. In some cases, female POWs were forced to march on foot for hundreds of kilometers during winter retreats, without adequate clothing or food, while male prisoners were transported by vehicle. In other cases, they were held in improvised detention facilities, barns, cellars, abandoned factories, where oversight was minimal and the opportunity for abuse was maximal. Survivors would later describe being denied access to sanitation facilities, being strip-searched under the pretext of security inspections, being subjected to mockery and threats by guards who faced no disciplinary consequences. What made these abuses particularly insidious was their systematic invisibility. Because the permission to commit them had never been formalized in writing, there was no paper trail, no command structure to investigate, no records to subpoena. It was a bureaucratic ghost, an atrocity enabled by silence and deniability. One survivor, a Polish resistance fighter named Zofia Kowalska, would later testify before an Allied commission. Her words, translated from Polish and recorded in the dry prose of military tribunal transcripts, nevertheless carried the unmistakable weight of lived horror. They told us we were not soldiers. They said the Geneva Convention did not protect criminals, and that is what we were, criminals against nature for taking up weapons. They said this while they took our boots, while they took our coats, while they made us stand in the snow for hours. They said this while their officers watched and did nothing, and we understood that we had entered a place where law had ceased to exist, where the rules that supposedly governed even war had been suspended for us, because we were women, and because they believed they could do what they wished without consequence. Kowalska survived because Soviet forces overtook the column she was marching with before the retreat reached German territory. Many others did not. Exact numbers are impossible to determine. The chaos of the war's final months, the deliberate destruction of records, and the deaths of many perpetrators in the war's final battles have left historians with only estimates. But documents recovered from Soviet archives, cross-referenced with German survivor testimonies, suggest that hundreds of female POWs died during these retreats, not from combat, but from exposure, malnutrition, and the consequences of systematic neglect and abuse. General Major Hartmann knew all of this because he had processed the requisition forms, the movement orders, the supply allocations that made these retreats possible. He had seen the discrepancies, the prisoner columns that left with 80 women and arrived with 60, the medical requests for female POWs that went unfulfilled while male prisoners received treatment, the reports that carefully omitted any mention of conditions or casualties. He had known, and he had said nothing. He had filed the papers, stamped the orders, and convinced himself that his role was purely administrative. That responsibility lay with the men who issued commands, not the men who enabled them. It was a fiction that had sustained millions of Germans throughout the war. The fiction of compartmentalized guilt, of obedience as moral shield. And it was a fiction that the courtroom at Nuremberg was systematically dismantling, one testimony at a time. When asked by the prosecution why he had not reported these abuses, why he had not refused to process orders that facilitated them, Hartmann's answer was quiet and devastatingly simple. To whom would I have reported them? The orders came from the highest levels. To refuse would have meant my own arrest, my own execution for defeatism or cowardice. And I told myself that if I was removed, someone worse would take my place, someone who would not even feel the discomfort I felt. I told myself this every day, and every day I was wrong. But there was another dimension to Hartmann's testimony, one that spoke to the ideological architecture beneath these atrocities. The Nazi regime's treatment of female prisoners was not simply a breakdown of military discipline under pressure. It was the logical extension of an ideology that had always viewed women through the lens of biological utility. In Nazi doctrine, women's primary role was reproduction, the production of Aryan children to fuel the Reich's expansion. Women who deviated from this role, who fought, who resisted, who took up arms, were not merely enemies but perversions of natural order. This ideology had real consequences in how female combatants were conceptualized. In internal SS documents recovered after the war, female partisans were referred to as biological saboteurs, a phrase that revealed the deep intersection of Nazi racial theory and its military practice. If the enemy was understood not just as an opposing army but as a racial threat, then women who fought for that enemy were doubly condemned, as enemies of the Reich and as traitors to their biological destiny. This helps explain why the abuses Hartmann described were not simply opportunistic cruelty by individual soldiers, but were tacitly encouraged by a command structure that viewed such treatment as ideologically consistent. It also explains why the permission to commit these abuses was transmitted verbally rather than in writing, not out of shame, but because the ideology was so deeply internalized that formal orders were unnecessary. The system communicated its values through silence and permission, through the absence of restraint. In the spring of 1945, as Germany collapsed, General Major Hartmann found himself caught in the chaos of the Reich's final days. Reichenau's former staff had been scattered across multiple retreating units. Hartmann ended up attached to a headquarters column fleeing westward, hoping to surrender to American or British forces rather than face Soviet capture. The roads were choked with refugees, civilians fleeing the Red Army, soldiers abandoning their posts, the human debris of a regime that had promised a 1,000-year empire and delivered 12 years of catastrophe. It was during this retreat that Hartmann witnessed an incident that would become central to his post-war testimony. The column he was travelling with had picked up a group of female prisoners, 6 women, a mix of Soviet and Polish fighters captured weeks earlier who had been force-marched westward from one collapsing defensive line to another. They were in desperate condition, emaciated, frostbitten, some unable to walk without support. The commanding officer of the column, a major whose name Hartmann recorded in a small notebook he kept hidden in his coat, ordered the women left behind. "We cannot spare the vehicles," the major said, "and they slow the column. Leave them at the next village. Let the Russians deal with them." One of the women, a Soviet lieutenant whose name Hartmann would never learn, spoke German. She stepped forward, her face hollow with exhaustion, and said something that Hartmann would repeat verbatim in his Nuremberg testimony. "You march us for 300 kilometers, you take our boots, you give us no food, and now you leave us to die because we are an inconvenience. But you tell yourselves you are soldiers, you tell yourselves you follow rules. What rules? What honour? You have destroyed yourselves more completely than any army could." The major struck her across the face with his gloved hand. The woman fell. The column moved on. Hartmann did not intervene. He did not speak. He sat in the back of a transport truck watching the 6 women recede into the distance, becoming small dark figures on a grey road in a ruined landscape, and he felt something crack inside himself. Some last pretense of moral distance, some final fiction that he was merely a witness to history rather than its instrument. Days later, when the column surrendered to American forces in Bavaria, Hartmann made a decision. He would talk. He would testify. Not because he believed it would bring justice. Justice seemed too vast and abstract a concept for the wreckage of Europe, but because silence had become unbearable. The impact of Hartmann's testimony extended far beyond Courtroom 600. His confession provided legal investigators with leads that would take years to fully pursue. It corroborated testimonies from survivors who had been dismissed as unreliable or exaggerating. It exposed the verbal order system that had allowed atrocities to occur without documentary evidence. And it forced a reckoning with one of the war's most uncomfortable truths, that the abuse of female prisoners was not an aberration or the work of a few criminal individuals, but a systematic feature of the Nazi regime's final phase, enabled by ideology and facilitated by a command structure that prioritized military necessity over human dignity. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and in many ways unsatisfying. Many of the officers who had transmitted or acted upon these verbal permissions had died in the war's final battles or had disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. Others, protected by the exigencies of Cold War politics, were never prosecuted. The major who had ordered the women abandoned on that road in Bavaria was never identified with certainty. The general who had briefed Hartmann's staff in November 1944 was killed in Berlin in the war's final days, his identity disputed by historians to this day. But Hartmann's testimony established legal precedent. It contributed to the development of international humanitarian law, particularly around the treatment of female combatants and the question of command responsibility for verbal orders. It became required reading at military academies studying the ethics of warfare, and it stood as documentary evidence of what happens when ideological certainty overrides moral restraint, when soldiers are told that the rules no longer apply, that their enemies are less than human, that cruelty is a strategic resource to be exploited. Among Hartmann's personal effects, recovered after his death in 1963, was a small leather notebook. In it, written in cramped handwriting during those final weeks of the war, was a single entry, dated April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th and final birthday, though Hartmann made no mention of that anniversary. The entry read, "I have tried to tell myself that I am not like the others, that I only push papers, that I never gave the orders myself, that I was a functionary in a machine I did not build and could not stop. But this is a lie. There is no innocence in efficiency. There is no neutrality in administration. The machine ran because men like me kept it running. We told ourselves we were professionals, that we were soldiers following orders, that history would judge the commanders and leave us in peace. But there is no peace in this. There is only the memory of roads and the people we left on them." This passage, later published in German historical journals, became emblematic of a certain kind of post-war reckoning. The accounting of those who were not the architects of atrocity but its facilitators, the men and women who had made the bureaucracy of horror function and who spent their remaining years wrestling with the unbearable weight of their complicity. The 6 women left on that Bavarian road were never identified. Soviet records contain no mention of them. Allied liberation documents, chaotic and incomplete from those final weeks, include hundreds of similar reports. Prisoners found wandering, prisoners found dead, prisoners who simply vanished into the great statistical darkness of war's end. Whether they survived to see liberation, whether they died of exposure or wounds in those final days, whether they were killed by retreating German stragglers or collapsing SS units, remains unknown. They have become, in the historical imagination, a kind of symbol, not of any single nationality or ideology, but of the specific vulnerability of women caught in the machinery of total war, subject to abuses that their captors believed would never be documented, never be prosecuted, never be remembered. But Hartmann remembered, and in remembering, in speaking, he transformed them from anonymous victims into historical evidence, from silence into record. It was an inadequate redemption, perhaps. It changed nothing for them. But it changed the historical account. It ensured that what was done to them was named, was documented, was entered into the long and painful archive of human cruelty that each generation must study if it hopes to do better than the last. In the decades following the war, historians and psychologists have studied the phenomenon that Hartmann's testimony illuminated, how ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil. The phrase, following orders, became shorthand for moral abdication, yet the reality was more complex than simple coercion. Many who participated in or facilitated atrocities during the Nazi regime were not sadists or fanatics, but professionals who had internalized a bureaucratic logic that separated action from consequence, that measured success in efficiency rather than ethics. Hartmann was, by all accounts, a competent officer. He kept meticulous records. He processed requisitions promptly. He ensured that his superiors had the information they needed to make decisions. That these decisions included the systematic abandonment and abuse of prisoners was, in his mental framework during the war, beyond his scope of responsibility. He was an administrator, not a policymaker. He followed the chain of command. He did his job. This compartmentalization, the ability to separate one's professional role from its moral implications, was not unique to Nazi Germany, though it reached perhaps its most extreme expression there. It is a human tendency, one that appears in every bureaucracy, every institution, every organization where action is diffused across multiple actors, and where no single individual believes they bear ultimate responsibility. What made Hartmann's post-war testimony significant was his rejection of this framework. In acknowledging his guilt, in naming his complicity, He performed an act that was both psychologically and morally radical. He accepted that there was no safe position within the machinery of atrocity, no role too small or too administrative to bear responsibility. He looked at the roads he had helped empty, the forms he had stamped that facilitated retreats where women died, and he said, "I was responsible, not in the same degree as those who issued orders or committed violence directly, but responsible nonetheless." This acknowledgement did not absolve him. It did not bring back the dead. But it broke the cycle of denial that had allowed so many others to live comfortably with their pasts, to claim that they had known nothing, done nothing, been powerless to change anything. The story of Hitler's verbal orders allowing the harassment of female POWs is, ultimately, a story about systems and silence. It is about how atrocities are committed not through dramatic declarations, but through quiet permissions, through the absence of written rules, through the understanding that certain actions will be overlooked and certain questions will not be asked. It is about how ideology, in this case, the Nazi conception of a women's biological role and the dehumanization of enemy populations, creates the conditions where abuse becomes not just possible, but logically consistent with the system's values. And it is about how that system depended on the participation of thousands of men like Hartmann, competent, educated, professional men who told themselves they were not truly complicit because they had not personally committed violence, because they had only managed the logistics, because they had been following orders. The verbal nature of Hitler's permission regarding female POWs was strategic. It created deniability. It ensured no paper trail, but it also revealed the regime's own awareness that what it was permitting violated even the corrupted legal frameworks it had constructed. The need to transmit these orders verbally, to keep them out of official records, was an implicit acknowledgement that they were, even by the standards of a regime built on violence and racial hierarchy, beyond justification. Today, in the archives of the United Nations War Crimes Commission and in the collected testimonies of the Nuremberg trials, Hartmann's statement remains part of the historical record. It is studied by scholars of military history and international law. It is cited in discussions of command responsibility and the obligations of subordinates when confronted with illegal orders. It is referenced in training materials for military officers learning about the laws of armed conflict. But perhaps its most important legacy is simpler and more personal. It stands as evidence that silence is a choice, that complicity is not inevitable, that even within systems designed to diffuse responsibility and normalize cruelty, individuals retain the capacity to name what they have witnessed and to bear truthful account. Hartmann's testimony did not prevent future wars or future atrocities. History has demonstrated again and again humanity's capacity for organized violence and our talent for constructing bureaucratic systems that allow ordinary people to participate in extraordinary harm. But testimony like his makes those acts more difficult to deny, harder to forget, more challenging to repeat without conscious moral choice. The last recorded mention of General Major Wilhelm Hartmann comes from a letter written in 1962, a year before his death. The letter was addressed to the widow of one of the female prisoners he had mentioned in his testimony, a Polish woman who had died during the retreats of 1945. Hartmann had spent years trying to identify the women from that column, to find their families, to give names to the anonymous victims whose abandonment he had witnessed. The letter was formal, careful, heartbreakingly inadequate. "I write not to seek forgiveness, which I have no right to request and which you have no obligation to grant. I write only to acknowledge that I knew what was happening, and I did nothing. I have carried this knowledge for 17 years, and I will carry it to my grave. Your daughter was brave. She spoke truth to those who no longer believed in truth. I hope that knowing she was witnessed, that her words were remembered, offers some small measure of meaning to her loss. It is all I can offer, and I know it is not enough." The widow never replied. Perhaps the letter never reached her. Perhaps she could not bear to read the words of a man who had been part of the system that killed her daughter. Perhaps she did reply, and that reply was lost to the imperfect preservation of history. But the letter exists, like Hartmann's testimony, like the notebook he kept, like the records of the Nuremberg trials. It exists as a small piece of evidence against forgetting, a fragment of accountability in the vast archive of war. And so we return to that courtroom in January 1946, to the smoke-thick air and the winter light filtering through windows that overlooked a ruined city. General Major Wilhelm Hartmann sits in the witness stand, his hands folded, his voice steady, confessing to a form of guilt that the law has not yet learned how to fully name, the guilt of the efficient facilitator, the competent professional, the man who kept the trains running on time without asking where they were going. His testimony will help convict some defendants. It will provide evidence for historical accounts. It will contribute to the slow, painful process of reconstructing what happened during those final months of collapse, when Germany's armies fled westward and left a trail of suffering in their wake. But perhaps its deepest significance lies in what it forces us to confront about ourselves, about the ease with which ordinary people can participate in systems of cruelty, about the distance we create between our actions and their consequences, about the stories we tell ourselves to make that distance bearable. The women on that Bavarian road were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were individuals with names and families and futures that were taken from them, not in the heat of combat, but in the cold calculus of retreat, by men who believed they would never have to account for what they had done. Hartmann's testimony gave them back their reality, gave back the truth that systems of power work so hard to obscure, that behind every policy is a person, that behind every order is a choice, that behind every efficiency is a moral decision. It is a truth that does not change the past, but it changes how we must face the future, with the knowledge that silence is complicity, that obedience is not innocence, and that the only defense against forgetting is the difficult work of remembering, even when memory is painful, even when it implicates us, even when the truth offers no comfort. The lights in courtroom 600 burn on into the winter evening. The stenographer's keys continue their steady percussion. And somewhere in that room, in the space between accusation and acknowledgement, between history and testimony, the ghosts of those unnamed women bear witness to the simple fact that they existed, that what was done to them mattered, that their suffering will not be erased by the convenience of silence. This is what justice demands, not that the past be redeemed, but that it be remembered, not that guilt be absolved, but that it be named, not that the dead be brought back, but that their deaths be acknowledged and their truth be told. And in that telling, in that naming, in that refusal to forget, there is no redemption perhaps, but there is responsibility, there is witness, there is the small, necessary light of truth against the gathering dark.